last time. Okay, thank you for joining me. Today we are in Research Methods, Psych 18, and I'm going to be talking about Chapter 6, Non-Experimental Research. So just to recap, just as with experiments, we are always going to consider the different types of validity. Remember that for internal validity, we are looking at causality or the confidence of a researcher to say that it was the manipulation of the independent variable that caused the change in the dependent variable. So it is the structure of the study that we're looking at. In external validity, we're looking at the results of the study. How well can these results be applied to other populations or other contexts? That's also known as generalizability. Content validity, now we're saying, are we studying what we say we're studying? In terms of psychology, we are usually considering psychological constructs that are not tangible. So it's really important for us to make sure it is clear to people looking at our research and to the participants that, for example, if we're talking about anxiety, we are operationalizing anxiety in a way that is specific, observable, and measurable. And finally, we have statistical validity, which has to do with the analysis of the data we collect. Was it appropriate? It's because of the statistical validity, whether we see significant differences between groups, where we can therefore have results that we can consider for external validity. So all of this works together to give us, a strong study. Yes, Justin.
So get straight. So statistical validity. I can never say that one.
Oh, it's a
Um,
computer. Yeah.
so does it involve like correlation?
It's one of them, yes.
And what others kind of study does it evolve with?
So later on, we're going to look at inferential statistics. So statistics includes things like mean, median, mode, correlations. It can include hypothesis testing. So that would be ANOVAs, t-tests, z-tests. There are a lot of different statistics that we can use. And again, this is driven by the research question. So if your study is just about what is the relationship between anxiety and social media use? We're talking correlations. If we talk about what is the effect of social media use on anxiety, now we're talking an experiment and we're going to be looking at group differences. So your research question is really going to drive the type of analysis that's going to happen in your study. And that's why it's so important to word it carefully.
Oh, and this is going to be involved for the new study we're learning about non-experimental, right?
Correct.
All right.
Yep. Okay, so non-experimental versus experimental research. We started with experimental research because experimental research has very definite characteristics, right? If you don't meet those three characteristics of covariation of the variables, manipulation of the independent variable, and ruling out alternative explanations, you have a non-experiment. So the biggest difference usually between the two is that in a non-experiment, there is no manipulation of the independent variable. Remember that experiments, because of their cost and rigor, we usually reserve that for things like interventions. And so if we're interested in causation, do we pursue an experimental design? Otherwise, if we are looking at, just learning more about a single variable, which is description, we would do a non-experiment. If we want to know about the relationship of variables together, but not looking to seek causation, we can do a non-experiment, and that would be a correlation. So remember that if you have a situation where it's not ethical to randomly assign somebody to be in one group or the other, then you cannot use an experiment. And we'll talk about that later. That's a quasi-experiment. So if we were to look at it as a spectrum with experiments on one end and non-experiments on the other end, quasi-experiments would be in the middle and actually closer to experiments. The only difference really between quasi-experiments and experiments is that you cannot randomly assign people to be in one group or the other. And that's usually because of ethical considerations.
Oh, so it doesn't involve with random assignments basically or random population, right?
Right. So you would have your participants, but let's say it's something to do with, cancer. If let's say your study, you wanted to look at people with cancer and anxiety, it is not ethical to randomly assign somebody to be in the cancer group, right? You're just going to take the groups as they exist. So maybe you'll have, the experimental group would be those who have cancer, right? In a quasi experiment. And then you would have those who maybe don't have cancer, and you want to see levels of anxiety between the two. So because of ethical constraints, you cannot randomly assign somebody to be in the cancer group. So you're going to go the quasi-experimental group way instead. And you can still do an intervention and do other manipulations. It's just that because of the ethical constraints, you're going to use a quasi-experiment.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, I'm glad. Right, so main types of non-experimental research are correlational, which we talked about, where you're kind of just looking at the relationship between two variables. Qualitative, and that's a different focus, where we're looking at more about interpreting information, maybe questions, interviews, things like that. Observational, where you're looking at people's behaviors. And then we have change over time, which are developmental designs. So for correlational research designs, what we're looking at is we have a phenomenon and we know that there are two variables, at least two variables that are consistently there. And what we're trying to figure out is there a systematic way these two variables are related? Is there something predictable that we can establish between the two variables? In a correlational study, we are not manipulating the independent variable. So we cannot say a correlational study supports that one variable causes the other, right? We're just saying that we see they're consistently moving in a predictable way together. We are also not attempting to control extraneous variables with a correlation. So in terms of internal validity, a correlation is much weaker than an experiment. But we use correlations a lot. We use it for the goal of description. We can use it for the goal of prediction. We can establish reliability. If you remember our discussion about reliability, we often talked about that magic number of 0.8 in terms of correlations. And we can also use it to establish validity in terms of the different types of validity, predictive, convergent, concurrent, those kinds of criterion validities. And we can also use correlations, multiple correlations, to support a theory. Remember that in psychology, we're not talking about proving theories, we talk about supporting them. Yes, Justin.
So to get this straight, basically, we're basically not manipulating any independent variables, nor are we going to have other variables come out of nowhere and doing some kind of manipulation itself towards the variables that we're studying. Instead, we're basically looking into the dependent variable, right? The measurements, how it's going consistent in this specific pattern.
Yeah, so remember, in correlation, we usually have an idea of one variable that we think is more likely to influence the other. And so that's what we would basically classify as our independent variable, even though we're not manipulating it. We would put that variable on the x-axis if we're mapping out the things. And then the other variable that we believe is related to it, we would have that on the y-axis. What we're trying to see is, okay, if the value of one variable goes up, let's say anxiety, does the value of maybe concentration go up as well? Or is it the opposite? So we're trying to establish a consistent pattern of how these variables relate to each other. You're right, we are not examining extraneous variables at all. So that's why if we have a correlational study, we want the correlation to be really strong to establish that support, to that consistent relation between the two variables.
All right.
Okay.
But we do have our independent variable and our
Dependent
variable.
Yes, that's correct. So here are just some examples of what, when we have data, we're going to plot them. It's called a scatter plot. And so if you have a very perfect negative correlation, it's the yellow square. You see if one value is high, the other value starts to go down. So that's a negative correlation. They're moving in opposite directions. A 0.5 negative correlations, you could see it's a lot messier, right? That's why it's just 0.5, but you can kind of see that it's going downward still. Zero correlation means there's no systematic way that the variables are related together. And then a positive 0.5, again, is messier, but you can sort of see an upward trend where when one value goes up, the other value goes up as well. And then a perfect positive correlation is where it's almost like a straight line, a 1-for-1 increase, that as one unit goes up on the independent variable, another unit goes up in the dependent variable. You will never see that in real life, but this is just for illustrative purposes. Any questions about this one?
What I got an understanding is that negative would look like that in the yellow, so it goes straight downwards. And if you had this like in a, a correlation design, you're gonna see the lines going up and down. So it looks like technically it looks like a triangle. If
Well, oh, I see, with including
you had if you had it, it will look like a right triangle with a Vex on it.
right. Well, that's if it were a perfect negative correlation. It's more
But if
likely,
it was like, yeah, if you're right, if it was all scattered away, you kind of get that kind of point in orange. But I guess you can still see the way how it's positioned. You get to see how it's still like 55, like a 50 negative
right.
percent.
Yes, exactly. So you should still see a trend in the way it's moving together.
Well, the middle one's just random. There's
That
nothing. There's
correlation.
nothing there in results of symmetry at all.
Yes, that is exactly true. So Pearson's R is the number that we look at in terms of correlation. With some limitations, if it's not a linear correlation, linear relationship, then it's going to be hard for Pearson's R to capture it. And I'll talk about the restriction of range issue, where sometimes unethical researchers are going to manipulate which parts of the data they're looking at to support their hypothesis. And of course, no one in our class would do that because we are all ethical researchers, right?
Yep.
Also, we cannot establish directionality, meaning because we're not manipulating the independent variable, we cannot say for sure that it is, for example, anxiety that causes any impairment in, cognitive performance.
Nope, we can't say that.
Could be that maybe somebody who is having problems thinking, their anxiety level increases, right? So that's what we mean by directionality.
We
And
can't point the fact, basically. We can't point at the fact that, oh, it's going to be this result. Instead, we're going to presume it's going to be that result, right?
right, right. We're going to make that assumption, but we are not going to say it causes it because we're not doing manipulation.
All right.
And then the third variable problem means that sometimes there's another variable that is actually influencing the relationship between the two that we're not even aware of. So the example I gave in class was if we were talking about children watching violent video games, and we're saying, well, some kids, their aggression levels don't get increased at all. Well, the third variable we found out was actually parental involvement. So if a parent is watching the violent shows with the kids and be able to explain to them, this is just a movie, you don't do this in real life, and things like that, well, we found out that those kids, their aggression levels did not increase. So, but if you think about it, so those are three variables that are working together. But in correlations, we're only looking at two. So it's always important to consider that there could be another variable that's at play that could be what we call mediating that relationship between the other two variables. So here's my restriction of range problem. So here we have the example here. BMI is the independent variable, so this body mass index. And then the y-axis is abdominal circumference. So we're saying that we believe that there is a relationship between somebody's body mass index and how big their waist is, right? So if we look at all the participants, it says they're all participants, it's R equals 0.82, which is a strong correlation. But let's say the researcher's hypothesis was like, was that the BMI doesn't make a difference. Well, if they want it to be a weaker correlation, then maybe they're only going to count the part of the data at the beginning, the first quarter. So R equals 0.51. If you want to change it again, look at, if you only focus on the BMIs between 20 and 25, suddenly the correlation is only R equals 0.47. What if you want to look only at the people with BMIs of 25 and 30? Now it's really weak. The correlation is only 0.18. And if you want to look at people with BMIs between 30 and 50, the correlation is 0.36. So you can see that if some researchers who are not abiding by ethical principles, they can actually manipulate the correlation you see based on how much data they are willing to share with the research with the group, right? So that is what we mean by the restricted range problem, is that you can have in a correlation, because it's imperfect, if you don't include all the data points or most of the data points, it can really impact the strength of the correlation of the study. Any questions about this one?
So you're saying basically that it is preferable to have all the participants, right?
Exactly.
And just keeping it all hidden, that this amount of people right here around 15 to 20, and just keeping the ones with the 30 to, let's say, 40.
Right.
Hmm.
Exactly. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So
Nice.
in a study, you want to see how many parts, because they're supposed to tell you how many data points they're excluding. If they're excluding a lot of data points, then that's really a red flag. Okay, so qualitative research actually started with anthropology and sociology. And usually here in qualitative research, we're really doing more interviews, focus groups. What we're focusing on here are deeper understanding of what is happening with our participants. So we would use this for the goal of description. Maybe something, a new phenomenon, we want to know what's happening with people. We would start interviewing them, especially if we don't know what the variables are that are involved yet. A qualitative study is actually a really good way to go. Conversely, let's say you start off with a quantitative study and you want to know more about what's happening. So let's continue with our example of anxiety and cognitive performance. Maybe for a specific group, we're seeing differences, right? Maybe we're seeing group differences with Gen X and Gen Z. What's going on here? Well, the only way you would really know is to do a qualitative study and talk to members of Gen Z and talk to members of Gen X to find out what maybe additional underlying factors are going on. So this is great for the goal of description and to generate new research questions. So in qualitative research, some ways that we gather data would be through interviews, which is usually one-on-one. A focus group would mean that you have, a small group of people that you're interviewing. And when we do qualitative research, what we're doing is we have to do interpretation. So as I mentioned in class before, you have to be able to account for the different things that people say in an interview so that people who are looking at the transcript can interpret them consistently. So perhaps it might be, oh, every time this person says, I don't like XYZ, then we have to make that as a negative reaction. So really what happens in a coding manual is you take the transcript and you pretty much line by line have to share how that sentence is going to be interpreted by the researchers who are looking at the transcript. So coding manuals are really thick. So qualitative research is easy to get the data, right? Because you're just doing interviews or focus groups. What's more challenging in qualitative research is the interpretation component. So there are different ways that you can do the interpretation for qualitative analysis. Grounded theory is one where you're not starting with a research paradigm, but you're using the interview results to create a theory. That's why we call it grounded theory. So you're looking what's going on with the participants, and from the trends that you see in what they're saying or what different people are saying, you come up with a theory for that particular situation. Discourse analysis is another way that you can analyze interviews. I had a colleague who, I mean, it was incredible. She would even analyze the pitch differences in an interview, how long people paused before people answered, all of those things, the words they selected in answering, that's all part of discourse analysis. So the analysis component in qualitative research is really really rigorous, right? So something to keep in mind. Mixed methods is where we combine qualitative and quantitative approaches. Personally, this is my favorite because you have a survey component where you're getting basic information, like maybe demographics, where they grew up, socioeconomic status, those kind of things. And then you have the opportunity to also ask them in-depth interview questions, and then you triangulate the results. So that's the key with mixed methods, is you want to ensure that your quantitative results and your qualitative results support each other. That's the whole key with mixed methods, and we call that triangulation. So it's kind of like you have the two vertices. One is qualitative, the other is quantitative, and then the convergence is the third vertices or vertex. Any questions about this one?
So basically, we can do two methods. Basically, we just combining them into methods. So that's what it pretty much is, right?
Yeah,
So
that's
we
why.
got one quantitative method right here with this group, and then the other one that is quantitative in that group, and then we just combine them, and we got a form of information, right?
So actually, you're gonna do it on the same group. So for mixed
Oh,
methods,
okay.
it's what it is you have one group, let's say you have 50 people, you would survey all 50, but you would also interview all 50.
Okay. All
You
right. All right.
Yeah. All right, so quantitative approach is what we primarily focus on in this class, where the data we're talking about are numbers, right? And we use statistics to help us draw conclusions. So quantitative, quanta, right, number, numerical. Our data have to do with numbers, and we use statistics to help us draw conclusions. For the qualitative approach, the data are words, not numbers. We focus on interpretations to help us draw conclusions. So advantages, so qualitative study, you get a lot of rich detail. If you want to learn more about what's happening, on to individuals, you go with a qualitative study. It helps with theory development because from all this deep knowledge you're getting about the participants, you might get perspectives and insight that you normally wouldn't in a survey. And it's really great for description of behavior. On the other hand, quantitative studies are great when you have a theory and you want to test it. So hypothesis testing. Based on this theory, we believe that, the group that is exposed to heat therapy will have less anxiety than those who are exposed to cold therapy, something like that. So quantitative studies are great for testing the theories, testing our hypotheses, and when you want a large sample, a large diverse sample, so that you have an increase in external validity because you have generalizable findings. Any questions about the differences and advantages between qualitative and quantitative studies? Okay. Let's go with observations now. So observations, here now, because we have a lot of technology, oftentimes we're going to record people. And so there are different types of observations you can actually have. So all observations have to do with systematic observation and recording. That's something they all have in common. But there are different approaches to observations. So with a naturalistic observation, you are looking at participants in a setting and that is not manipulated. So watching kids play in a playground or going to a classroom and seeing how people behave in a class setting. Those are naturalistic. You're not bringing them into a lab. So a disguised naturalistic observation means that the participants do not know they're being observed. You could do this, like for example, in UC Santa Cruz, their child development center has one-way mirrors so that it's a classroom, but sometimes on the other side, you have graduate students doing observations to learn more about how kids interact with each other. So that's a disguised naturalistic observation. In an undisguised naturalistic observation, the participants know that you're there. The problem with that, of course, is what we call reactivity, that because they know somebody is watching them, that they might not behave in a way that is authentic, and that's always problematic. But the truth is that after about 20 minutes, people will start behaving how they normally do, regardless of whether there's somebody there or not. Participant observation means that the person who's observing is actually engaged with the class. So there are some problems with that. There are quite a few researchers who are like, this is not good. The researchers should not be participating with the with them, with the participants, because it was going to change the dynamic of the relationship. But, they're mixed groups in terms of whether or not participant observation is a good idea. A structured observation means that you're looking at specific components. So maybe you have a 5-minute recording of kids playing in a playground. Instead of trying to see everything that's going on, you might do a structured observation in which every 30 seconds you're seeing how many times a child is friendly. So you could be breaking up what you're doing in a structured observation is you're breaking up the observational period into specific time points and focusing on specific behaviors. So that's what we mean by structured observation. Again, this would be something where you have a specific hypothesis that you're probably testing to see the frequency of certain behaviors. In a case study, that is when you are observing somebody with an unusual, maybe something unusual going on, something very rare. That would be a case study, because otherwise you want to have as many, a fairly large participant pool. And then archival research has to do with doing the research through records. So let's go a little bit more. So with naturalistic observation, again, is qualitative data. You're looking at people in the field, meaning you're not bringing them into a lab. And usually you would do it to describe what is happening and observe behaviors. So broad range of behaviors could be like you're kind of figuring out everything that's going on in a playground. So kids are playing in the swing, kids are going down the slide, kids are playing together, they're playing tag, all these different behaviors. That's broad range. Or you could be narrow. I'm only going to look for instances of aggression, like that kind of thing. So different ways you can approach naturalist observation. So some ways you collect data could be field notes, meaning you're taking down notes as you're watching what's going on. That would be coming from anthropology. Oops. Oh, it didn't show the other one. Sorry about that. There are other things that you can include, like video. Again, we do a lot of recordings. You might do some interviews, right, with informants, and you might have documents as well. So what you want, the goal is you want a complete and accurate description of what's going on, with a certain situation. You want to describe things like the settings, the people, maybe the weather, any kind of variables that might help explain what's going on. And then you want to analyze the observation. And the key here is to look for patterns of what's happening in your observation. Any questions about this one so far? Okay, so in a systematic observation, you are looking for maybe 1 or 2 specific behaviors in a setting. So you're not trying to record everything that's going on. Again, you want to have a coding system to make sure that the multiple researchers can look at the same observation and come to the same conclusion. That is inter-rater reliability. So for methodological issues, one is participation, right? Is the observer participating? And is it impacting what the participants are doing? There is concealment. If the observer is not visible, eventually, are we going to let the participants know that they are being observed? Reliability. Again, we want to establish inter-rater reliability so that anyone looking at the same observational recording can come to the same conclusion. Oops. What happened there? I'm sorry, something happened. Sorry about this. I'm not sure what happened.
I didn't ask, but when we went back to that encoding one,
Yep.
like, can it be color coded so we'd be able to like measure it more specifically? Like if it was behavior, we're looking narrow it down to like anger, we can color code it in like a red substance, so we know that it'd be anger. This is the topic of anger. If we
How
had
is
some of
it
it.
if it's a recording though?
Oh. Well, I thought it was more like an observation kind of thing, so we'd be able to narrow it down by behavior and we just color code it by that. If we were writing it down.
Oh yeah, if it's a transcript, yes, you could do something like that. Sure, you could do something like that. But again, that would be you looking at the observation or maybe looking at the transcript and you breaking it down to what you believe it is. So let's say you're in a research lab and you're looking at a transcript, right? someone else in your team is going to look at the same transcript. And the key is that both of you will need to come up to like 0.8, 80% of the time, you two are going to have to agree on the interpretation of that transcript.
I hope my teammate agrees to me.
Yeah, that's what we hope, right? That's what we want. That's the inter-rater reliability that we want to establish.
Maybe we can play rock, paper, scissors and see what ideas to go with.
It's actually very iterative. It's really iterative. You're gonna, it's very rare that on the first time around that you're gonna have 80% agreement between the two. It's a lot of work. So sampling is like, how long are you going to observe them? Are you going to do multiple instances? Are you just going to do one 10-minute stretch? Are you going to do 5 minutes, wait a bit, and then another 5 minutes? So there are different ways that you can sample observations. Equipment, you want to make sure your equipment is reliable. If you're doing a recording that, don't have Wi-Fi issues, things like that, it's important to consider that as well. And then reactivity, as I mentioned before, if the participants are aware that they're being observed, that it might alter their behavior. So you want to make sure that that is addressed as well. Case study. So we have case study and we have something known as single subject research design, which is in chapter 10 in our textbook. For a case study, either way, we use that if there's a rare condition, something special about the individual, like the girl who grew up in the wild, Jeannie, or if there's some setting that is very unusual. That's when we would do these kind of approaches. A case study is a qualitative way of doing it, where maybe if it is that individual, you would try to interview them or do a recording of them. In single subject research design, it's a quantitative way. And in single subject research, you're collecting many different data points about this one person. So you might interview the person, and then you would interview their parents, siblings, close friends, significant others, their therapist. Then maybe you might even get physiological data. How is their blood pressure doing? So you would take a lot of different data points to help support whatever hypothesis you might have about this individual. So in both situations, whether you want to do it qualitative or quantitative, it is for a rare condition or setting or individual. In archival research, so what we're doing here is that we are looking at statistical records, study archives, publicly available documents. So there was something, for example, Smith, Clements, and Olson looked at the prevalence of colors like pink and purple and red for females as opposed to blue, black, brown for males. So that was something where they were actually looking at previous ads, publicly available documents, media, things like that, and they were analyzing it. So with archival research, this is not other people's studies. These are primary source data, such as birth certificates or death certificates or marriage certificates or media posts, things like that, and you're doing an analysis about them. So archival research in terms of ethics, it would be exempt research because you're not actually interacting with people. But what you are doing is you're examining documents and you're trying to draw inferences from those documents. So with developmental research designs, now we're looking at what's happening over time. When we talk about developmental, we're talking about a focus on how people change, from one point to another. Three main types: longitudinal, cross-sectional, and cohort sequential. So with longitudinal, we start off with one group of people at the same age, and then we follow them over different periods of time. Maybe every 10 years, every 15 years, we keep bringing them back. And this is fantastic. This is like the gold standard for developmental psychologists because it's the only way we really can identify developmental change, because we're looking at the same people. So that is what makes it very powerful. What's not great about it is it's really expensive because every time you bring these people in, you've got to pay them, right? The other part is that things happen to your participant group. So you have to start with a large enough group, a large enough participant group that if people drop out for moving, maybe they're bored, sometimes they die, you want to have a large enough group as the years go through. So that is a big challenge with longitudinal designs. So here's an example. UC Santa Cruz has a longitudinal study that's been over 29 years. So they started and they still have like about 100 individuals and they keep following them over time. And so there are a few studies that are longitudinal and so valuable for learning about what's happening with people. Then you have cross-sectional. So cross-sectional is more like a snapshot picture. So with this cross-sectional design, you're collecting data at one point about people from different age groups. And then what you're doing here is you have to infer the differences in the age group. So what's great about it is it's not very time consuming because you're only collecting data at one point and it's not very expensive. And the drawback is it's not really developmental change you're seeing. You have to kind of say, okay, for example, what you're talking about in your study, Justin, you're saying Gen X and Gen Z or Gen Alpha, two different generations. It's not necessarily that it's developmental differences, but it could be because of the cohorts that they're in. So that's what makes it different with cross-sectional. So whenever you see a study that talks about a portrait of things or children, a snapshot, then you know it is actually cross-sectional data. And the last one is cohort sequential, which is a combination of the two. So with cohort sequential, you start off with different age groups and then you follow them over time, which is really nice. It's kind of a best of both worlds situation where you have the longitudinal component so you can actually see the developmental change, but you also have different age groups so you can see generational differences as well. So in terms of non-experimental research, these are the different types. We have correlational, right, where we're looking at systematic change in variables. Qualitative, which gives you deeper insight, don't need as many people. Mixed methods, which combines both quantitative and qualitative components. So you'd have a survey and probably interviews of the same people. Observational, where you have some kind of recording and you're interpreting behaviors that are going on or words that are being said. And then you have the developmental types, which are change over time. And usually those would include other designs. So let me go ahead and stop sharing. Let me stop the recording. Thank you so much for joining me.